The story of the giants. There's a long ridge north of Highway 16 in central Tripp County, South Dakota, in a prairie country west of the Missouri River once called the Great Muddy. It looks out of place, that ridge, not exactly fitting in with the flatlands around it. It looks to me like someone put it there, after the prairies were made. I've heard there was a time when that ridge was not there. They say it was a summer of many storms, that time when Red Calf's people were camped on a prairie north of the Running Water River, and south of the Great Muddy. Cloud and Plum were married in the moon of berries ripening in May. 2 evenings later, a storm blew in from the southwest so fierce that the old ones said it was the worst they ever knew. The winged ones stayed out of the sky, 2-legged stayed inside shelter, and 4-legged hid inside thickets. Women braved cold raindrops and stinging hailstones to pound in picket pins so that the buffalo hide lodges would stand strong in the howling winds. The night sentinels covered their heads with buffalo robes as they stood watch. Big black clouds rolled across the sky, and the thunders shouted their mighty voices crackling and rumbling, and their angry eyes flashing with the light of 100 suns. But that storm was not the worst thing that happened to Red Calf's people that summer. While they waited out the wind, rain, and hailstones, something dark and ugly came out of the night, ripping into their lodges. Cloud and Plum huddled together in their new home, pitched behind her parents' lodge as the great storm rumbled and blew. Their lodge stood strong in the wind, however, and they knew would pass as all storms do. But from the darkness they heard cries of fear, of terror. Dogs barked and howled in fright. Men shouted warnings that were lost in the wind. Women and children screamed. Something ripped their lodge from its picket pin, something more powerful than the wind. A mountainous black figure, far taller than the lodge, stood outlined against the lightning flashes. It was Ea, the giant, with the strength of 1,000 men, the blackest of hearts, and a bottomless hunger that drove him to terrible deeds. A hand, larger than a grown man, reached in and snatched Plum away from Cloud like someone plucking a new leaf. Before Cloud's unbelieving eyes, the hand tossed the struggling Plum into a mouth like a large hole in the ground, and she was gone. He was shocked and couldn't move as Ea tore apart the village to satisfy his ravenous hunger. Many lodges were torn apart that night. Many minds were numb with fear as Ea swept through the village. No one, no anything could stop him. Cloud and a few other young men pulled themselves together to grab bows and send arrows at the giant, but the thing paid them no heed. Ea grabbed girls and young women and tossed them into his wide, slobbering mouth. Then he was gone into the blackness of the stormy night, leaving behind torn, scattered lodges, confusion, and grieving hearts. By dawn, the storm weakened and the people began to put their village back together, but they could only grieve for their precious one snatched up by the giant. Red Calf gathered the council of old men together to consider what to do. It is no use to do anything, some said. Ea was too big and powerful. The only thing to do is move the village and hope he doesn't return, some advised. Women began to take down the lodges in preparation for the move, and men gathered the traveler dogs to pull the loads, for this happened in the time before horses came. Cloud didn't intend to make the move. He was angry. Ea had taken his new wife, and he could only imagine her pain and terror. He went to his mother and father and announced that he would gather his weapons and strike out after Ea. Word spread quickly of Cloud's plan, and 7 others joined him. Soon 8 stalwart young men headed east, armed with lances, knives, and bows and arrows, and a terrible anger. Ea's trail was easy to follow. His footprints were so deep that rainwater gathered in them. Redcalf led the people north toward the great muddy river, as the 8 young men took the trail of revenge after Ea. After half a day's travel, they found him asleep on a hillside, far enough away to look small. When they were a long bow shot from him, Ea awoke. They hid and watched as a giant stretched and scratched. He was an ugly beast, naked and unwashed, with twigs and branches caught in his long, tangled hair. He scowled with the air of someone with nothing to fear. Cloud and the others had never seen Ea. They knew him as an imaginary creature in the stories told by the old ones, a fiction made up to scare them into behaving. Grandma Littlebird would only smile secretively when he or his sister Shawl, as small children, would ask if Ea was real. Now there he sat, bigger than any living thing Cloud had ever seen. And somewhere inside his stomach were Plum and all the other girls and young women the thing had snatched up. Cloud had never felt so small. He was a fine hunter, helping his father to keep his family fed and clothed since he was 12 winters old. He already had a good reputation as a fighting man, a warrior. But on the hunt or the warpath, he had never faced anything like Ea. His cousin Black Fox asked the question on all their minds. How will we defeat such a thing? No one could answer. We will think of something, was all Cloud could say. Ea arose and walked eastward, flattening everything in his path. Rabbits, deer, and antelope scurried out of his way, and the birds in the air flew away from him. They followed him the day long until a giant stopped at dusk to sleep in a gully. They could hear him snoring. The young men made camp without fires, so as not to attract Ea's attention. They rested and ate wasna, pemmican, and talked in whispers, not knowing how sharp his ears were. Cloud suddenly thought of a way to kill him. We will trap him, he announced. How can we trap him? Fretted Slow, who worried about everything. He is stronger than all the men in the village put together. True, agreed Cloud, but he has a weakness. In the stories he was always hungry, remember? That is his weakness. We will use it to trap him. We will offer him food. You are crazy, retorted Slow. We are his food. Will you offer one of us? Yes, replied Cloud patiently. I will offer myself. I will get him to chase me, and then I will lead him to the trap. What trap? A hole in the ground that we will dig. You are crazy, said Yellowhawk. How can we dig a hole big enough for Ea? Do you care for your sister enough to try? Asked Cloud. Do you want to end her suffering and take her home? Me? I want my wife back. I will do what I must because I do not want to live without her. Through the night, they talked about Cloud's idea. 6 would dig a hole, while 2 of them, Cloud and 1 other, would decoy Ea and lead him to the trap. When the new day dawned, they went forth with determination. The place they chose for the trap was a dried-up creek, in a flat plain where the ground was sandy and easy to dig. They quickly made stone axes. 2 deer were killed for meat to feed the diggers because they would work night and day. When the digging started, Cloud and Yellowhawk left to find the giant. They would need to keep him decoyed until the signal was given that the trap was ready. Then they would lead him to it. They thought Ea was dim-witted, and counted on that to help them. But something else turned out to be more helpful. They found him easily when they went downwind of him. Ea smelled bad because he never bathed, and could be located at great distances when the wind was right. Slow and the others dug and dug. The thought of their loved one suffering inside Ea's stomach gave them strength. Dirt piled up on both sides of the trench as they dug deeper and deeper. Ea slept for most of 2 days. After awakening, he wandered aimlessly across the prairies. Everywhere he went, the animals and birds fled from his path. Days and nights passed. The diggers worked without rest. Out on the prairie, Ia suddenly set out with long strides. Cloud and Yellowhawk ran to keep pace. They had to do something to stop him. After sunset, they built a fire to attract his attention. When he came to it, they built another about an arrow's cast away. Using that simple trick, they were able to lead him back to the west. Each time he came to one fire, they stole away into the darkness to build another. In the daylight, they made heavy smoke by piling green grass on the fires to attract his attention. All went well for a time, until Ia spotted them. Dim-witted though he was, he did have keen eyesight. With a roar of surprise and anger, he stumbled after them. The ground shook. Ia's feet were like boulders crashing to the earth. One of his strides was 20 of theirs, yet they were able to stay away from him, sometimes going in opposite directions to confuse him. It was a dangerous game that went on, and Cloud and Yellowhawk grew tired because they could not rest or eat. They shouted encouragement back and forth, reminding one another that they must save their women. Back on the prairie, the trench was growing deeper. Slow and the others worked their fingers and knuckles bloody. They broke several stone axes and made new ones. They used knives and lance points, too. Of course, they had no way of knowing how it was with Cloud and Yellowhawk, or if the ugly giant could be lured to the trap. But they kept digging, even as several sunrises and sunsets rolled by. No one slept, because the thought of their women inside the ugly giant's stomach was enough to make them dig harder and harder. Slow measured the depth of the trench and found it to be as deep as 5 men standing on top of one another. It was finished. Now it was time to signal to Cloud and Yellowhawk. They gathered driftwood from a nearby creek and dried brush from a grove to cover the trench. Then a large pile of dried wood was arranged atop one ridge of dirt and set ablaze, the signal for Cloud and Yellowhawk. Ia was sleeping again, which was good because Cloud and Yellowhawk needed to rest and eat. They suddenly saw a fire in the distance and knew what it meant. Slow, Black Fox, and the others had finished the trap. Yellowhawk's leg was still hurting. Ia had nearly grabbed him, but he had been able to slip away from his grasp. He had tumbled down into a gully and badly wrenched his knee. Cloud hid Yellowhawk in a low plum thicket. Ia had nearly stepped on them several times as he searched for them, yelling his frustration. Now the trap was ready, and Ia had to be lured to it. Cloud would be the bait by himself. Yellowhawk was angry because he couldn't help, and Cloud had to convince him to stay hidden. Cloud prepared himself. He prayed and made offerings. Making sure Yellowhawk was well hidden, he went after the angry and dangerous Ia. It was easy to find Ia, and easier to get him to follow. To him, Cloud was a little pest to be crushed. With a roar like thunder, he took up the chase. To stay alive, Cloud had to keep out of the giant's long reach. The chase continued through the day. Cloud was tiring, but the thought of Plum inside the giant gave him courage. From the top of a rise, he could see the enormous piles of earth thrown up by Slow and the others. Ia was growing tired also, but he kept going because he was hungry. Cloud led him across the prairie and toward the mouth of the trench. Slow and his companions saw Ia approaching and hid. If the ruse worked and Ia fell into the trench, they had to loosen the abutments that would collapse the mounds of earth into the trench. Closer and closer Ia came, looming larger and larger. Then they saw a figure running before him. It was Cloud, and it was plain that he was near the end of his endurance, stumbling badly and falling every few steps. Cloud had thrown away his weapons since they were useless against Ia. Soaked in sweat, he ran only on sheer willpower. He fell many times, and each time fought mightily to regain his feet and push on. If he didn't, the giant would crush him like an insect with one swat. Down a grassy slope, Cloud lost his footing and slid to the bottom. Ea's hand came down like a falling tree. Cloud rolled aside to barely avoid being flattened. He had no more strength in his arms and legs, and his mind was numb. He was too exhausted to be afraid. He had given everything he had, and could do no more. Closing his eyes, he waited for Ea to crush the life out of him. Then he saw Plum in her wedding dress, the soft smile on her beautiful face, her dark eyes full of hope and love. He saw two small children, a boy and a girl, playing along the banks of the smoking earth river. Cloud knew the images he saw were his dreams, dreams inspired by Plum. Somewhere deep within, he found a pebble of strength, one last spark of hope to save Plum, to make their dreams come true. With a bellow of rage like a newborn's cry of life, he rolled away from Ea's outstretched fingers and leaped to his feet. The ground shook as Ea lurched forward. Cloud somehow made his legs move and led Ea toward the covered hole he knew was there. Slow and the others watched, barely breathing, as the giant, kicking up clouds of dirt, lumbered toward their hiding places. Cloud saw the brush over the opening, and knew he had to carefully place his feet. Behind him, Ea's mouth, nearly as wide as a lodge, was curled into a snarl, his yellow teeth bared and his long black hair swirling about like black smoke. Cloud was halfway across the covered trench when he heard Slow's shout of triumph, quickly drowned out by Ea's cry of surprise and a loud cracking. He flung himself off the brush covering, barely a heartbeat before it gave way. Ea was far too heavy for the brush covering. He broke through it and down into the trench. Ea fell to the bottom with a great thud and was caught firmly in the hole. Dust billowed upward as he struggled, filling the air with his deafening yells of rage. Slow dragged Cloud to safety and signaled Black Cloud to collapse the abutments holding the dirt piles. The dirt slid down into the trench. A huge cloud of dust rose upward. Ea's roars turned to frightened whimpers. His free arm reached up, and one hand clawed at the edge of the hole. His legs were caught firmly, and he could not free himself. He struggled with all his might, coughing as dirt covered his massive head. Soon his struggles weakened, and he coughed no more. His leg twitched the last time, and a silence fell over the land. A limping yellowhawk appeared, and all the young men stood gaping at the dead giant. Somehow they had defeated it. But there was no joy, no feeling of victory. Grabbing a knife, Cloud jumped down into the trench and began to slice open Ea's stomach. By no means was it a pleasant task. Foul air and a greenish-yellow slime leaked out. Cloud yelled for help as he reached in and pulled out the body of a girl covered in the slime, more dead than alive. But she was alive. There was hope for the others. With a yell of triumph, the 7 other young men jumped down into the pit as Cloud enlarged the opening and found more bodies. All the young women and girls were still alive, but barely. The young men pulled them out of the giant's stomach and hauled them out of the trench and then quickly to the nearby stream. In its cool waters they were gently revived and cleaned. Plum regained her senses and felt her husband's gentle hands washing her face, and wept for joy. There were many tears of joy that day. The young man filled in the hole to cover Ea's body, and the dirt piled higher and higher until it became a long ridge. In time, grass and cactus grew on it. Cloud and Plum grew old together. They raised 2 children along the way, a boy and a girl, and treasured the laughter of several grandchildren. Cloud wore the blue blanket of headman for many winters after accepting it from old Redcalf. The people followed him because they knew him to be wise as well as brave. On stormy summer nights, Plum would gather her grandchildren and tell them the story of a terrible, ugly giant. The little ones would ask Grandma Plum giants were real, and she would only smile, secretively. So would Grandpa Cloud. It was so long ago, that summer of many storms, in the days before the coming of horses. Plum, Cloud, Yellowhawk, Black Fox, and all the others live only in stories now. The same is true of Ia. But there is a long ridge covered with grass and cactus, running east to west. Many people drive by it every day. To most, it is only a long hill. A few of us, though, still remember the story of how Ia was defeated. We know that ridge is his grave. But in our hearts, we think of it more as something built by love, courage, and perseverance, and by giants.